Module 8, Frequently Asked Questions about Psychology. We have reflected on how scientific approach can restrain biases. We have seen how case studies, naturalistic observations, and surveys help us describe behavior. We have also noted that correlation studies assess the association between two variables, which indicates how well one thing predicts another. We have examined the logic that underlies the experiments, which use control conditions and random assignment of participants to isolate the effects of independent variable on a dependent variable. And we have considered how statistical tools can help us see and interpret the world around us. Yet, even knowing this much, you may still be approaching psychology with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. So, before we plunge in, let's entertain some frequently asked questions. What psychology applied? When you can see or hear about psychological research, do you ever wonder whether people's behavior in the lab will predict their behavior in real life? For example, does detecting the blink or faint red light in the dark room have anything useful to say about flying a plane at night? If after playing violent video games in the lab, teens become more willing to push buttons than they think electrically shock someone does, this indicates the playing shooter games will make someone more likely to commit violence in everyday life? Before you answer, consider the experimental intends the laboratory environment to be a simplified reality, one that stimulates and controls important features of everyday life. Just as the wind tunnel lets airplane designers recreate airflow forces under controlled conditions, a laboratory experiment lets psychologists recreate psychological forces under controlled conditions. An experiment's purpose is not to recreate the exact behavior of everyday life, but to test theoretical principles. In aggression studies, deciding whether to push a button that delivers a shock may not be the same as slapping someone in the face, but the principle is still the same. It is the resulting principle, not the specific findings, that help explain everyday behaviors. When psychologists apply laboratory research on aggression to actual violence, they are applying theoretical principles of aggressive behavior, principles they have refined through many experiments. Similarly, it is the principles of the visual system developed from experiments in artificial settings. The researchers apply to more complex behaviors such as night flying. As many investigations show that principles derived from the laboratory do typically generalize to everyday world. The point to remember, psychological science focuses less on particular behaviors than on seeking general principles that help many behaviors. And remember, although psychological principles may help predict behaviors for a group of people, they may minimally predict behavior for any individual. Knowing students' grades level may clue us to their average vocabulary level, but individual students' word power will vary. Does behavior depend on one's culture and gender? What can psychological studies done in one time and place, often people from what researchers called wired cultures, really tell us about people in general? As we will see time and time again, culture shared ideas and behaviors that one generation passes on to the next matters. Our culture shapes our behavior. It influences our standards and promotes promptness and frankness, our attitudes towards and varying body shapes, and our tendency to be casual or formal, and willingness to make eye contact, our conservational distance, and much more, much more. Collectivist cultures, for example, emphasize group goal, while individualist cultures put priority on individual goals. Being aware of such differences, we can restrain our assumptions that others will think and act as we do. Given the growing mixture and clashing of cultures, our need for such awareness is urgent. It is also true, however, that our shared biological heritage unites us as universal human family. The same underlying process guides people everywhere. People diagnosed with specific learning disorder exhibit the same brain malfunction whether they are Italian, French, or British. Variation in languages may impede communication across cultures, yet all languages share deep principles of grammar, and people from opposite hemispheres can communicate with a smile or a frown. People in different cultures vary in feeling loneliness, but across cultures, loneliness is magnified by shyness, low self-esteem, and being unmarried. We are each in certain respects like all others, some others, and not like no other. Studying people of all races and cultures helps us discern our similarities and our differences, our human kinship, and our diversity. You will see throughout this book that gender matters too. Researchers report gender differences in what we dream and how we express and detect emotions, and in our risk for alcohol use disorder, depression, and eating disorders. Gender differences fascinate us, and studying them is potentially beneficial. For example, many researchers believe that women carry on conversations more readily to build relationships, while men talk more to give information and advice. Knowing this difference can help us prevent conflicts and misunderstandings in everyday relationships. But again, psychologically as well as biologically, women and men are overwhelmingly similar. Whether female or male, we learn to walk about the same age. We experience the same sensations of light and sound. We feel the same pangs of hunger, desire, and fear. We all exhibit similar intelligence and well-being. To the point to remember, even when specific attitudes and behaviors vary by gender or across cultures, as they do often, the underlying processes are much the same. Ethics and research. Many psychologists study animals because they find them fascinating. They want to understand how different species learn, think, and behave. Psychologists also study animals to learn about people. We humans are not like animals. We are animals sharing a common biology. Animal experiments have therefore led to treatments for human diseases, insulin for diabetes, vaccines to prevent polio and rabies, transplants to replace defective organs. Humans are complex, but the same processes by which we learn are present in rats, monkeys, and even sea slugs. The simplicity of the sea slug's nervous system is precisely what makes it so revealing the neural mechanisms of learning. Sharing such system is precisely what should we not respect our animal, what makes it so revealing neutral. Sharing such similarities, should we not respect our animal relatives? We cannot defend our scientific work with animals on the basis of similarities between them and ourselves. It defend morally on the bias of differences, noted Roger Urchlich. The animal protection movement protests the use of animals in psychological, biological, and medical research. Researchers reminds us that animals used worldwide each year in research are but a fraction of 1% of billions of animals killed annually for food. And yearly, for every dog or cat used in an experiment, we and cared for under humane regulations. 50 others are killed in inhumane animal shelters. Some animal protection organizations want to replace experiments on animals with naturalistic observation. Many animal researchers respond that this is not a question of good versus evil, but of compassion for animals versus compassion for people. How many of us would attack Louis Pasteur's experiments with rabies, which caused some dogs to suffer but led to vaccine and spared millions of people from agonizing death? And we would really wish to have deprived ourselves of animal research that led to effective methods of training children with mental disorders, of understanding aging, and of reviving fears of depression. To answer such questions vary by culture. In Gallup surveys in Canada and the United States, about 60% of adults deem medical testing on animals morally acceptable. In Britain, only 30% do. Out of this heated debate, two issues emerge. The basic one is whether it is right to place the well-being of humans above that of animals. In experiments on stress and cancer, it is right that mice get tumors and hope that people might not. Should some monkeys be exposed to HIV-like viruses in search of AIDS vaccines? In our consumption of other animals as natural as behavior of carnivorous hawks, cats, and whales, defenders on research on animals argue that anyone who has eaten a hamburger, worn leather shoes, tolerated hunting and fishing, or supported extermination of crop-destroying or plague-carrying pests have already agreed with us that yes, it is sometimes permissible to sacrifice an animal for the sake of human well-being. Scott Plous notes, however, that our compassion for animals varies, as does our compassion for people, based on perceived similarity to us. As Module 79 explains, we feel more attraction, give more help, and act less aggressively towards similar other likewise. We value animals according to their perceived kinship with us. Thus, primates and companion pets get top priority. Other mammals occupy the second rung on the privilege ladder, followed by birds, fish, and reptiles. On the third rung, we insects at the bottom. In deciding which animals have rights, we have drawn our own cutoff line somewhere across animal kingdom. If we give human life first priority, what safeguards should protect the well-beings of animals in research? One survey of animal researchers gave an answer. Some 98% supported government regulations protecting primates, dogs, and cats, and 74% supported regulations providing for the humane care of rats and mice. Many professionals, associations, and funding agencies have already had such guidelines. British Psychological Society guidelines call for housing animals under reasonably natural living conditions with companions for social animals. American Psychological Association guidelines state that researchers must ensure the comfort, health, and humane treatment of animals, minimize infection, illness, and pain. The European Parliament now mandates standards for animal care and housing. Animals themselves have benefited from animal research. One Ohio team of research psychologists measured stress hormone levels in samples of millions of dogs brought to each year in the animal shelters. They devised handling and stroking methods to reduce stress and ease the dog's transition to adoptive homes. Other studies have helped improve care and management in animals' natural habitats by revealing our behavioral kinship with animals and remarkable intelligence of chimpanzees, gorillas, and other animals' experience have also led increased empathy and protection for them. At its best, a psychology concerned for humans and sensitive to animals serves the welfare of both. Does the image of white-coated scientists delivering electric shocks trouble you? If so, you'll be relieved to know that most psychological studies are free of stress, with people blinking lights, flashing words, and pleasant social interactions are more common. More so, psychology's experiments are mild compared to stress and humiliation, often inflicted by reality shows, TV shows. In one episode of The Bachelor, a man dumped his new fiancée on camera at the producer's request. For the woman who earlier had finished second, occasionally, though, researchers do temporarily stress or deceive people, but only when they believe it is essential and to adjustable end, such as understanding and controlling violent behavior or studying mood swings. Some experiments won't work if the participants know everything beforehand. Ethical principles developed by American Psychologists Association, by the British Psychology Society, and by Psychological Internationally urge researchers to 1. Obtain potential participants informed consent, 2. Protect them from physical or emotional harm and discomfort, 3. Keep information about individual participants confidential, and 4. Fully debrief people. Moreover, most universities now have an ethics committee and institutional review board. This screens research proposals and safeguard participants' well-being. The idea is the researchers to be sufficiently informed and considerate to the participant will leave feeling at least as good about themselves as when they came out. Better yet, they should be repaid by having learned something. Psychology is definitely not value-free. Values affect the way we study and how we study it, and how we interpret results. Researchers' values influence their choice of topics. Should we study worker productivity or worker morale? Gender discrimination or gender differences? Conformity or independence? Values as such color the facts. As we noted earlier, our preconceptions can bias our observations and interpretations. Sometimes we see what we want to expect or to see. Even though the words we use to describe something can reflect our values, in psychology and everyday speech, labels describe and labels evaluate. One person's rigidity is another's consistency. One person's faith is another's fantasism. One country's enhanced interrogation techniques, such as cold water immersion, become torture when practiced by its enemies. Are labeling someone as firm or stubborn, carefully or picky, discreet or secretive reveals our own attitudes. Popular applications of psychology are also contained in values. If you differ to professional guidance about how to live, how to raise children, how to achieve fulfillment, what you do with feelings, and how to get ahead of work, you are accepted, valued. Latin advice. A science of behavior and mental processes can help us reach our goals, but it cannot decide what those goals should be. Some people see psychology as merely common sense. Others have different concern that it's becoming dangerously powerful and is an accident that astronomy is the oldest science and that psychology the youngest. To some, exploring the external universe seems far safer than exploring our own inner universe. Might psychology, they ask, to be used to manipulate people? Knowledge, like all power, can be used for good or evil. Nuclear power has been used to light up cities and demolish them. Persuasive power has been used to educate people and deceive them. Although psychology does indeed have power to deceive, its purpose is to enlighten. Every day, psychologists are exploring ways to enhance learning, creativity, and compassion. Psychology speaks to many of our world's great problems: war, overpopulation, prejudice, family crisis, crimes, all of which involve attitudes and behaviors. Psychology also speaks to our deepest longings for nourishment, for love, for happiness. Psychology cannot address all of life's greatest questions, but it speaks to some mighty important ones.